let me say what a pleasure it is to be back at the Asia Society. I've spoken about China here many times over the years, and the last time I was here already, we could see all the storm clouds gathering over the U.S.-China relationship. Now, to be fair, we've always had a turbulent relationship. Even at the very inception of U.S.China relations in 1972, when our countries began their long journey into normalization and new forms of cooperation, yet were fighting each other on Southeast Asia battlefields through Cold War proxies in Vietnam. Over 4 decades, we've cooperated on many issues, but that turbulence, the cyclical ups and downs in U.S.-China relations, has never gone away. And this should surprise no one. Even when the United States and China have shared interests, our distinctive political, economic, and social systems and our distinctive histories have ensured that there will be plenty of obstacles for leaders on both sides to negotiate. But now I have to tell you that I believe something of deeper significance is happening. We may be moving beyond cyclical ups and downs. This is because we are now having to navigate our distinctions and differences at a moment of change, challenge, and potentially even of crisis. Today, against this backdrop, we must look warily at the prospect that what until now has been a healthy strategic competition could tip into a full-blown Cold War. Some of you will know, and I guess all of you will know, because Josette just told you, that I've been in Singapore helping to launch the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. And that is a country that has had to navigate quite a few challenges and changes itself. Kuan Yew, Singapore's first prime minister, understood better than most the challenges of keeping peace and assuring prosperity in such a complex part of the world. In interviews before his death, Mr. Lee said, "Power politics in Asia is as old as the first tribes that emerged. And whether we like it or not, if we are to survive and maintain our separate identities, it is necessary that we should learn what is in the joint interest at any single time of a group of nations." I fear we are quickly unlearning Mr. Lee's lesson. There's a lot of finger-pointing between Beijing and Washington these days. And yet, for all the struggles, tension, and disagreement, America has been well served by the effort to work through problems. Indeed, in this 10th anniversary of the 2008 financial crisis, I look back at my own work in China when global markets were on the brink of collapse as an example of tough but cooperative interaction. Today, I'll talk about 3 things. First, how the United States and China arrived at this moment of heightened tension. Second, the biggest risks for each side. And third, a few modest suggestions to begin the long process of setting U.S.-China relations onto a more sustainable footing. So, how did we get here? The drivers of the current downward spiral aren't, in my view, necessarily complicated. And while my version of the story isn't, of course, the whole story, it reflects, I believe, what has happened on the American side. First, we have diverging interests. On many issues where the United States and China should agree, such as North Korea, we often pursue divergent approaches. That means that common interests haven't yielded enduring cooperation. Worse, our lack of sufficient cooperation has persuaded many people that we never shared an interest in the first place. Second, the United States and China disagree about some important rules governing the international system. Are you having trouble hearing me or something? Okay. One example is maritime rights and customs, a disagreement that recently brought our navies into near collision on the high seas. Third, American and Chinese views are quite simply opposed in some critical areas. On some issues, we advocate vastly different ideas for international governance. For example, China and Russia argue for cyber sovereignty and the right of the state to control data and cross-border data flows. The U.S. and the EU, while not in perfect agreement with one another, both reject those Chinese and Russian views. Taken together, these and other drivers, such as China's cyber practices and island building in the South China Sea, have fueled a new consensus in Washington that China is not just a strategic competitor, but very possibly our major long-term adversary. America's long-standing engagement policy is widely viewed as being of little use for its own sake. Nobody is arguing against dialogue, but everyone is arguing that results of the U.S.-China dialogue and engagement have been poor. The tariff war between the United States and China will eventually be concluded. Hopefully soon. Nobody wins a trade war. And China can agree to enough of what President Trump seeks to enable a deal he can be proud of if it also marks the beginning of the negotiation of a high-ambition trade or investment agreement. But I also happen to believe that the underlying tensions will persist. That is because the problems we face and our divergence of views, even in the economic area, is much broader. Unless these broader and deeper issues are addressed, we are in for a long winter in U.S.-China relations. Let's take the economics. The United States played a decisive role in facilitating China's entry into the World Trade Organization. Yet 17 years after China entered the WTO, China still has not opened its economy to foreign competition in so many areas. It retains joint venture requirements and ownership limits, and it uses technical standards, subsidies, licensing procedures, and regulation as non-tariff barriers to trade and investment. Nearly 20 years after entering the WTO, this is simply unacceptable. It is why the Trump administration has argued that the WTO system needs to be modernized and changed, and I agree. But it also helps explain why so many influential voices now argue for a decoupling of the two economies, especially with respect to technology-related trade and investment that will disrupt supply chains. These arguments will not go away anytime soon. They will drive a variety of new approaches from this administration and from its successors. Both Democrats and Republicans are saying so. And this negative view of China unites politicians from both the left and the right who agree on nothing else. Trade with China has hurt some American workers, and they have expressed their grievance at the ballot box. And while many attribute this shift to the Trump administration, I do not. What we are now seeing will likely endure for some time within the American policy establishment. China is viewed by a growing consensus not just as a strategic challenge to the United States, but as a country whose rise has come at America's expense. It is in this environment, it would be helpful if the U.S.-China relationship had more advocates. That it does not reflects another failure, in large part because China has been slow to open its economy since it joined the WTO. The American business community has turned from advocate to skeptic and even opponent of past U.S. policies toward China. American business doesn't want a tariff war, but it does want a more aggressive approach from our government. How can it be that those who know China best work there, do business there, make money there, and have advocated for productive relations in the past are among those now arguing for more confrontation? The answer lies in the story of stalled competition policy and the slow pace of opening over nearly 2 decades. This has discouraged and fragmented the American business community, and it has reinforced a negative attitudinal shift among our political and expert classes. In short, even though many American businesses continue to prosper in China, a growing number of firms have given up hope that the playing field will ever be level. Some have accepted the Faustian bargain of maximizing today's earnings per share while operating under restrictions that jeopardize their future competitiveness. But that doesn't mean they're happy about it. Nor does it mean they aren't acutely aware of the risks or even thinking harder than ever about how to diversify their risks away from and beyond China. Meanwhile, Chinese firms are permitted to operate in other countries in ways that foreign firms cannot act in China itself. That exacerbates these underlying tensions. And so I do believe that China's actions and failure to open up have contributed to this more confrontational view in the United States. The messages from Beijing over the last 5 years sound this way to American ears. First, the Communist Party commands all. That is why, for example, party committees, not corporate boards, are being strengthened within both public and private firms as a tool of external supervision. Second, private businesses must support the strategic goals of the state, not necessarily market or commercial goals. That is why the emphasis in China's state-owned enterprise reforms has been on mixed ownership, pooling private with state capital to buttress and strengthen the state-owned firms. Third, foreign firms are not needed in many areas and must act in ways that bolster China's indigenization of technology, knowledge, and business processes. And this third apparent message is absolutely central to the current intensification of U.S.-China tensions. It is not just that foreign technologies are being transferred and digested, it is that they are being reworked so that foreign technologies become Chinese technologies through an indigenization process that many of multinational CEOs I talk to believe is grossly unfair to the innovators and dreamers at the heart of their companies. And this may now become a source of heightened confrontation as China exports aspects of its model and its standards through initiatives like the Belt and Road. For example, while most of the headlines about Belt and Roads focus on ports, power generation, and highways, the unsung story may be the Digital Silk Road, an initiative that can export Chinese models of cyber governance, the very model that I earlier mentioned as a source of tension with the U.S. and EU. Now, as I said, I know quite well that Chinese decision makers have their own long list of grievances and concerns with U.S. policy. Washington has work to do to address some of these Chinese concerns. For instance, I don't like to see Chinese investments in our country turned down when there is no national security risk, especially when they will create American jobs. But frankly, the political context has changed dramatically in both capitals. So just as Chinese policymakers tell Americans to stop trying to make China into something that it isn't, I encourage the Chinese decision makers to recognize the changed context in the United States. The fact is, Beijing's ask cannot be addressed in this new context unless something happens to shake the current trajectory or raise questions in Washington about the wisdom of the emerging consensus I have described. Americans increasingly believe China is a peer competitor pursuing adversarial policies and a major strategic challenge. And I'm describing this to you in stark terms because I believe that if we stay on this trajectory, it will compromise the context of U.S. policy for years to come. So that brings us to the risks, and they are considerable. It would be easy to step back from all of this and conclude that while we face an intensification of strategic competition, it does not disrupt our economies wholesale, much less our daily lives. But sadly, I think the risks of a new age of disruption are considerable. Here's the nub of it. For 40 years, the U.S.-China relationship has been characterized by integration of four things: goods, capital, technology, and people. And over these 40 years, economic integration between the two countries was supposed to mitigate security competition. But an intellectually honest appraisal must now admit both that this hasn't happened and that the reverse is taking place. And technology is a critical driver of this change. In today's world, technology is a critical part of business success, blurring the lines between economic competitiveness and national security. Security competition is bleeding extensively into economics and business. And more than that, economic tensions are reaching a breaking point. The result is that after 40 years of integration, a surprising number of political and thought leaders on both sides advocate policies that could forcibly deintegrate the two countries across all four of these baskets. The integration of trade and goods could come undone as supply chains are forcibly broken, especially for those that use sensitive technology. Integration through cross-border capital flows will come under ever greater pressure as restrictions on Chinese investment take hold across big sectors in the U.S. Indeed, if this trend continues, we need to consider the possibility that the integration of global innovation ecosystems will collapse as a result of mutual efforts by the United States and China to exclude one another. Some in the United States now advocate a Cold War-style technology denial regime. And this is partly because of a growing consensus that China has been using policies and strategies that foster the indigenous development of high technology to set its own standards and ultimately pursue self-reliance. Pervasive technology theft, forced technology transfer, including within joint ventures, and different models of internet governance and cross-border data flows are all contributing factors. Yet innovation and technology cannot be separated from business competitiveness. So such balkanization of technology could further harm global innovation, not to mention the competitiveness of firms around the world. Meanwhile, the integration of people, especially the brightest young students, could also stall, as Washington potentially bans Chinese students from studying whole categories of science and engineering subjects. If this all persists across all four baskets of goods, capital, technology, and people, I fear that big parts of the global economy will ultimately be closed off to the free flow of investment and trade. And that is why I now see the prospect of an economic iron curtain, one that throws up new walls on each side and unmakes the global economy as we have known it. Now, as a practical matter, rather than an aspirational one, China still relies on a lot of global capital, trade, investment, and foreign know-how. And so the most strident calls for decoupling are actually coming from the United States and to a lesser extent from Europe, not from China. But here's the problem for those in my country who advocate a U.S. China divorce. Decoupling is easier when you're actually a couple. But the United States and China are not, in fact, a couple. There are more than two players here, and the rest of Asia in particular gets a vote. So the U.S. can try to divorce China by restricting flows of good capital, technology, and people. But what if others, especially in Asia, don't want to follow suit? Many years of working in and around Asia have taught me this. I do not believe that any country in Asia can afford to divorce China or even wishes to do so. This is a function of their geography, of economic gravity, and of the strategic reality they live with each and every day. It is true that many governments and businesses around the world share Washington's current concerns, and sometimes these governments and businesses are pursuing similar policy and business choices, particularly with regard to screening and investment screening for national security risk, which is being bolstered by a number of countries, especially in Western Europe. Excuse me. But let us not presume this also means that everyone, including America's closest clients, are ready to divorce China, as some in Washington would now have it. On the contrary, no country, in my view, will divorce a major nation that remains, even amidst the slowdown, among the world's fastest growing major economies. So in an effort to isolate China, the United States risks isolating itself. Consider what would happen if, for instance, if multinational companies decided they should be headquartered somewhere else, still aiming to ride the wave of a growing Chinese economy, but in a country less hostile to their doing business with Beijing. Hosting scores of leading, best-in-class multinational corporations is among America's greatest competitive strength, and it is one that America now risks surrendering if it cannot get right its links with the world's fastest-growing economies, including China's. Frankly, de-integration is inevitable and even necessary in some areas, not least to protect our national security. But it is decidedly not in America's interest to attempt this across the board. Divorce doesn't work well for global businesses. And the same can be said for trade policies that drive companies and countries away. That is exactly what worries me about the new clause Washington inserted into the recent U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which aims to short-circuit or even veto efforts by America's partners to open China's markets through their own trade negotiations. Why would Asian countries, which are negotiating the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership among a group of 16 that includes China, walk away from their negotiation at the behest of the country that pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? I presume they will not. So instead of pursuing a carefully calibrated de-integration focused on sensitive and critical issues, the U.S. seems instead to be flirting with a comprehensive de-integration. And through initiatives like the new trade clause, Washington now strikes many people as attempting to disrupt all aspects of China's external economic relationships. This risk setting Washington up for a new round of battles with its allies and partners, the very partners it needs to help alter China's behavior. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what I mean by American self-isolation. But let us also be clear that if China wants to keep its relationship with the United States from spinning out of control, it is going to have to look hard at some of its choices and policies. Above all, that means China will need to rediscover the spirit of market-driven reform and opening up, which would address long-standing criticisms while doing wonders for the Chinese economies too. This marks the 40th anniversary of reform and opening up in China, the remarkable transformation launched by Deng Xiaoping at the Third Plenum in 1978. It's been a good run for China over these 40 years, and it has been especially good run for China since it joined the WTO in 2001. Its $1 trillion economy in 2001 is becoming a $13 trillion behemoth measured in nominal GDP. Its $220 billion in foreign exchange reserves has ballooned over the same period to a staggering $3 trillion, some of which is now being plowed into direct investments and acquisitions overseas. But what China has lost, especially over the last decade and a half, is the bold impulse to reform and open up that led leaders like Zhu Rongji to undertake significant changes to the state-led sector in the 1990s as Beijing prepared for WTO succession. Zhu Rongji saw competition as a key to China's long-term economic success. In those days, China's future seemed inextricably linked to the world's. But today, the prevailing view in the U.S. is that China is increasingly content to pursue its own standards, privilege its domestic rules, and erect rather than demolish walls for foreign competitions. And so I continue to encourage China's leaders to pursue reforms in three baskets in particular. The first is competition reforms. Foreign firms need to be allowed to compete with Chinese firms on a level playing field. And for that matter, Chinese private firms should be allowed to compete with state firms in the same way. The second area involves the role of the market. As an investment banker, I worked with hundreds of companies in dozens of countries on 5 continents. And I learned this: firms that succeed are run as commercial firms, not as agents of the state. They allow the market to drive key decisions, and they respond to the market, not government signals. China will always have a large state-owned sector, of course. So China should strengthen those pillars that permit firms, yes, even the state-owned firms, to be run commercially. That means strengthening corporate boards, not the Communist Party committees as a tool of external supervision. And it means allowing top-flight managers to run those firms as real managers. And by the way, running all firms, state and private, as commercial firms, will help level the playing field for foreign firms too. Third, China must foster and protect innovation. Policies of forced technology transfer should end. China should work to prevent cyber theft and better protect intellectual property. And a mandate for indigenous innovation should not be used to limit competition, including through the use of standards. And so China has an important decision to make. The key to avoid an economic iron curtain is for China to see its interests clear in making these kinds of reforms and changes. If China doesn't move quickly, I suspect the calls for divorce will intensify. And it pains me to say this. But at this point, after 40 years where we've had one kind of relationship, but now quite clearly face the daunting task of transitioning to a new one, anchored in a realistic and more sustainable strategic framework, divorce is a real risk. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't believe the current trajectory can be easily reversed. It has been a long time coming. Big structural changes to U.S.-China relations were inevitable, and at this point are definitely desirable. There aren't easy answers, but then nothing worthwhile is ever easy. As a first priority, it is essential that we alter the downward spiral for the well-being of our nations and the world. But to do so will require thoughtful people to make some tough decisions. To get things started, I offer these considerations for both sides. For China, first, do no harm. For example, implement robust rules of engagement to prevent PLA Navy captains from the kind of maneuver that nearly resulted in a collision in the South China Sea last month. Second, work constructively with American allies and partners. In recent years, when China's relations with Japan or India or South Korea or the Philippines have taken a serious downturn, those pressures have bled into U.S.-China relations too. It is no longer possible to separate U.S.-China relations from China's posture in Asia. Third, be bold. Open your economy. Have confidence that your firms can compete and no longer need to hide behind a wall of government protection. And as I have already said, I believe this kind of competition would be good for China too. Fourth, be proactive in protecting proprietary foreign know-how and end policies that directly or indirectly compel technology transfer. Fifth, work with the U.S. on its topmost strategic priorities, especially North Korea. It is sad for me to say that in an area like that, where the U.S. and China are so clearly should share an interest in denuclearization, we too often have appeared to be working at cross purposes in recent years. As for the United States, first, dial down the rhetoric. Strategic competition is a fact. We have compelling differences of national interests between our two countries, and we clearly have clashing security concepts, not least in the South China Sea. But China does not pose an existential threat to American civilization. In the 242nd year of our great democratic experiment, we should have more confidence in America and resilience of our system. We should prepare for the obvious strategic challenges from China, but in doing so, let's not sacrifice those values or the commitment to openness that has made us the strongest, most competitive, and most admired country in the world. Second, enlist partners, and then working in a coalition with these partners, try to foster some workable understandings with Beijing. China has a different political and economic system, so this isn't easy and it never has been. But while China doesn't support a liberal order, it does need a functioning global order, just as we do. Therefore, we should still be working hard to see if China is prepared to help ensure that institutions we rely on can be made more effective to deal with today's pressing problems. The World Trade Organization is perhaps the best example. It is in desperate need of an upgrade. So why shouldn't China and the United States be part of leading efforts to bring the WTO into the digital age? While it is true that American trade and investment policies surely need a new direction, I simply do not understand the Trump administration's rejection of approaches that would align the trade architecture in Asia more compellingly. To be blunt about this, I wish President Trump would reconsider his decision to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. A TPP 2.0 would offer a ready-made vehicle to shape the trade environment in which Beijing operates. Third, negotiate with China, and when you negotiate, do so with clear objectives. That means finding frameworks not just to discuss issues, but to resolve them. And resolving them almost certainly means working in closer coordination with like-minded partners. For instance, why not pursue a multi-party investment agreement with China? Jointly withholding access to the U.S., EU, and Japanese markets, not as an end in itself, but instead as part of a structured negotiation with Beijing that aims to test the prospect of opening there with clear incentives and strong disincentives. Fourth, and under any scenario, invest in America big time. A strong military, a strong economy, strong educational institutions, strong investments in science and engineering, openness to the world, investment in security and economic partnerships in every continent, but especially in Asia and Europe. These things are essential if the United States is to compete and thrive in the world of the 21st century. There is simply no substitute for getting our own policies right. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the most essential ingredient if America is to compete with China smartly. Now and in the future, with favor, not fear, with confidence, not caution. There is no doubt in my mind that how the United States deals with China and how they deal with us will shape the geopolitical landscape for this century. The U.S.-China strategic interaction is by far the most consequential in the world. I am very sobered by the trajectory we are now on. And ultimately, I think it could pose a risk to the very functioning of the international system. As Treasury Secretary, I presided over the U.S. response to the 2008 financial crisis. So I know a little something about systemic risk, and I simply cannot see how the international system can endure when the two countries that comprise some 40% of global GDP and over 50% of global growth are working at cross purposes, attempting to deintegrate their two economies and contesting the foundations of a rules-based order at every turn. Now, Washington and Beijing don't always share our interests, but on a variety of functional issues that can make or break the global economy, they still need to work in complementary ways, or failing that, they need to manage and attempt to mitigate the consequences of their disputes. In the past, if the U.S. and China cannot find a way to develop a workable consensus, it will pose a systemic risk of monumental proportions, not just to the global economy as I dealt with, but to international order as we know it and to world peace. Both countries need an international system that functions, because international order is one of those things that is simply too big to fail. And so the alternative is unacceptable. And that is why I'm hopeful that statesmanship will prevail. Right now, we're proceeding down divergent paths, and we're in danger of facing a long winter before we reach what may still be a rather patchy spring. But I believe spring will come, so the questions are, how long will the winter last, and how much unnecessary dysfunction and pain will be inflicted along the way. The answer will be determined by the capacity and willingness of leaders in Washington and Beijing to think creatively and sometimes even disruptively. In 1972, our leaders established an initial framework for a world beset by Cold War and locked in ideological conflict. At various points along the way, they had to recalibrate. Today's world looks nothing like the world of the 70s or even of the 2000s. New technologies, new economic challenges, new geopolitical challenges, all of these have eroded the framework of the past. So we've reached another of those consequential moments, and the stakes for our economy and for the world are higher than ever before. We need to craft a new framework that works for today's world, not the world of the past. And for that, we will need statesmanship, wise and strong leadership in Washington and Beijing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Many questions to follow, but I would like to know when, for you, at what point things began to shift from strategic competitor to potential long-term adversary, as you said. Was there a particular incident or time when that happened? And some have pointed to the South China Sea in the sense that the peaceful rise was over as the beginning of that tipping point in a different direction, or was this inevitable?
Josette, I can't put a specific time on this. That there have been major structural changes, as I've outlined in my speech. I think it was inevitable that we were going to reach a point where we were going to have to recalibrate. Sure, there have been certain things that stand out along the way, but I think this is I've seen this coming for a while.
And you've talked about, divorce is not the best option. And in a way, I remember the discussions in the government when you proposed the idea of a strategic economic dialogue with China, it was actually to get at some of these issues, avoid, potential deepening separation between the U.S. and China on this. Would you do things different now? Did that bear any fruit? Is that?
Yeah, well, I look at it, so everybody, I want to not be overly defensive here, but as I look at it, when I came to Washington, I had looked at the way the U.S. was dealing with China, and I didn't think it was effective because I didn't think we were focused and we were prioritizing and we were really dealing with this strategically. There are so many different dialogues go along. And so we set up a dialogue, I think it wasn't just to talk, it was dialogue and negotiation with a purpose. And I look at it and I say it was successful. That initially the focus was on currency, if you remember. And so we pressed very hard on currency, and I think we got real movement, and I think it was successful. I was also pushing hard to open up the financial markets, and we got a financial crisis. And that obviously stalled that effort. The Chinese said to me, you were our teacher. The teacher doesn't seem so smart now, right? And so it was obviously, if you were a vested interest, it was a lot easier to resist that reform. But I would argue that during the financial crisis, I wouldn't argue, I know that the strategic economic dialogue and my relationship with key leaders, with Wang and Josette, made a big difference. I think the world would be a very different place today if we didn't have that dialogue, or it wasn't a dialogue. I could get them on the phone any hour of the night or during the day on a moment's notice, and it bore real fruit. And so I look at it, so those that say, well, dialogue hasn't worked, I can't I can comment on the period when I was there, and I think when I was there, it served its purpose. It worked well, and I've always believed that you need a framework to through which to negotiate.
You know, I will say many of us observed the SED moving from what seemed like, very strategic, often very small meetings, very specific, focused on very tight issues, to kind of an aircraft carrier of a dialogue with, many working groups, and the whole thing became very bureaucratized.
Yeah, so what happened, and, I was pleased when the Obama administration carried on with the concept, but they wanted to improve it, right? Everybody's got to do it their way and do it better, and so this was the strategic and the economic dialogue in it, and so many things got mushed together that it became more bureaucratic. I, of course, like, I think one of the issues I think one of the biggest, perhaps the biggest economic risk in the world today is climate risk. And so one of the things we had done with the SED was put in place the 10-year framework for energy and the environment. And so, of course, I was pleased when Obama, used that framework to do the Paris Agreement. But I do think that perhaps there was so much focus in that area that the Chinese may have bought him off in terms of other things. I don't know, but I've learned it's hard when you're, having sat in the seat I sat in the financial crisis. I'm not quite as willing to sit outside and be looking from the outside in and critiquing what others have done. I can just comment on what happened with the SED, and we really made a big point to be focused, to be strategic, to focus on relatively few issues at any one time, because that's what you've got to do if you want to get something done.
You really pinpointed a huge gap, if you will, in the global system, and the WTO was created before the internet existed. It doesn't deal with cyber issues. It doesn't really deal with the intellectual property issues and many of the things that have been a constant irritant in the trade relationship with China. What do we do about this? Because the WTO's effectiveness, is in question as these skirmishes happen all over the world on these key issues that really aren't addressed in that.
Yeah, well, the WTO, Josette, I see is emblematic of virtually all of our multinational, organizations. That the world has changed, and they need to keep up with the changes in the world. I mean, we saw it in our country during the financial crisis, right? We had a regulatory system that was put in place at the time of the Great Depression. It was set up to deal with banks and bank runs. Then the economy changes and 50% of credit flows outside of the banks, and we don't have a system that works. Well, there's been all kinds of changes in the global economy. And sure, it doesn't deal with the digitization, but it's much more than that. I mean, it never envisioned a $13 trillion behemoth, as a developing nation. And tariffs are no longer the protectionist tool of choice, right? They're all the standards and the regulatory barriers and all the things that exist behind the borders that the TPP was looking to get at. And so it really needs to be redone. I mean, right now it's really there as an enforcement mechanism, and it's one that really doesn't have terribly strong teeth. So I'm not one that argues it was a mistake for China to go in the WTO. It can make the case that at the time it made a big difference. And even in terms of U.S. exports to China going up 500%, services 900%. I mean, it was a right decision at the time. The problem is the world has changed, and the WTO hasn't been modernized to deal with the global economy as it exists today.
Seems like a urgent issue. You said in your speech that ultimately, if we're going to change this trajectory, it depends on leadership. And I'd like to ask you about Xi Jinping. Is he a different kind of leader than we've seen before? How much is that a factor in where we're headed? And how do you see that playing out?
Well, he's clearly a different type of leader than I've seen before. He's, I had my first, Deborah Lair, who's here somewhere at the Paulson Institute, was working with me when we made our first trip to China as part of the SED. And she had argued, and it wasn't hard to make the argument, that I should go to Hangzhou first rather than going, which didn't really please the State Department at the time, rather than going first to Beijing.
Deborah always has great ideas.
Yeah, and we said, and the reason was we didn't want to, we wanted to send a signal that the world didn't just revolve around Beijing and Washington, right? But I wanted to emphasize the private sector being the future of China. And, when I last met with Xi Jinping, we'd had a great conversation about the private sector being the future. And I promised him I'd see him when I next went to China. Now, I didn't know it was going to be his Treasury Secretary. So I went to China, I went to Hangzhou, and that evening, before I met with him, we met with all sorts of private companies. So we met only with private companies, and we talked about the private sector. And
the Alibabas and others based there.
A whole bunch of them. And so he, and so that was his point. And if you looked at the provinces where he had been party secretary and been involved, the private sector played a big role. And so that's what attracted me. And early on, as you remember, right after, in the first party Congress, the 18th, he came out and he said, when we're dealing with economic resources, the markets are going to be decisive in allocating the economic resources. And so that was what he said. But when you look at what he's done with the party, I would put it this way. Jiang Zemin referred to the party right as being the big tent. And he wanted to bring elites into the party. So he talked about bringing business elites, academia, whatever, into the party. Xi has now turned the clock back, and he said, wait a minute, the party is the elite. Forget about these other being the elite. We're going to bring the party and put the party in other organizations. And so he is now governing through the party, not through the bureaucracy, not through the state. So to me, that's the big issue. And so now, how is that? Now, we could talk about relevance to a whole lot of areas. We could spend a lot of time, which I'm not talking about humanitarian issues and human rights and freedom of speech and so on. Let me just talk about it as it relates to the economic development of China. That I'm not going to repeat what I said in my speech. So you heard me when I said about organizations needing to be run commercially if they're going to be successful. I also think that applies to the Chinese economy. If whether or not they're going to, it remains to be seen whether he's going to drive toward having the market be decisive. But right now, what I see is when I look at subnational state-owned enterprises, which really are not corporations, they're just part of the municipal government's borrowing. Mm-hmm. I'm looking at more investment going in that area and massive misallocations of inefficient allocation of capital, which will slow China's growth. I've run a global company, and I needed access to all the information I could get to run it in terms of what was happening in every country, what were the regulatory situation, what was the political situation, all the news, everything, wired all the time. So I don't know how you tighten up on access to information and you have the party playing a bigger role in companies and have them ultimately be successful. So I think that has some bearing on how a successful Chinese economy will be in the future, because I don't think they've invented a better form of capitalism. I just don't.
And markets have a way of striking back. I mean, what do you see a potential financial crisis coming out of if this trajectory continues, or just slower growth, or?
Well, Josette, one of the things, I've got great humility about being able to predict financial crises, right? And I would. That's funny, but not that funny, right? Yeah. But I would argue, without being defensive, that they're unpredictable. And there's always someone that says, "Yep, I predicted it," but that person.
Well, predict it just so 5 years from now you can say
if that person predicted it, I guarantee you, he or she won't predict it next time. And so it's hard to predict it. But I will tell you this: I don't. I basically look at the Chinese economy as basically fundamentally sound. It's not something that people think it's going to collapse. I believe it's sound, and it's got some really strong inherent characteristics that it's going to make it successful. But the issue that I see in terms of all the misallocation of capital at the state-owned enterprises at the subnational level, it's all in Chinese currency, so it's not international debt. They don't have open capital markets. They don't have an open capital account. So I don't see much likelihood of a panic. The kind of, we dealt with the most perverse, severe form of crisis, which is a panic when all forms of credit collapse, money flees to safe, safest assets, treasuries, borrowing, lending dries up, it costs jobs and all sorts of things. I think what you're more apt to see is something where the state bears a heavy cost, because these losses are building up, and the Chinese people and the government ultimately are on the hook for those. So I'm not nearly as I'm not predicting a financial crisis in China, but a slowdown. You just realize China is such a significant part of the global economy that just a slowdown impacts growth all around the world. So we benefit from China's growth, not just in terms of our exports to China and or cross investment. We benefit because they, by driving global growth, they improve the environment for our exports all around the world. And when they slow down, it has a significant effect. And so everybody's watching what happens in China. So I think, slowdowns or events in China will lead to volatility in global markets.
I want to tease out a little bit this idea of decoupling. You talked a little bit of whether it can actually even happen or can be effective, but what does the U.S. get out of decoupling? You said in a few strategic areas, obviously for national security reasons, it may be important, but play this out. Is this?
I don't have any more to play out than I said in my speech. Yeah. I mean, I played that out as far as I'm going to play it out. I think that that there are areas where we have to decouple, where there's clearly a real national security interest, and there are areas where we have to decouple. There are other areas where there are all kinds of forces leading us to decouple. And I'm saying the extent to which we do that, it will tend to create an economic iron curtain, or to isolate the U.S. from if we try too hard to isolate China and do it in across the board, we may end up isolating the United States.
We had an official here from China who said the problem with Americans is that they've romanticized China in their own image, and everyone's thought we'd end up being a democracy just like you, and now you know what we've always known, that that's not going to happen. How much truth is there? Truth in that?
Well, who knows what Americans are, whatever we are, a whole lot of people, as we've found out, that have got all kinds of views. But I would say that I can speak for myself and most others that were, I'm sure you fall in this category and many other knowledgeable people in this room. We never felt, or I never thought, that reform in China meant they were going to look like us. I never thought that they were going to become a Jeffersonian democracy. I never thought that they wanted to have a liberal global order. I always knew the party was going to be very important, if not dominant, in China. But so that hasn't surprised me. Now, has it surprised me that we've seen the change that I described, and I won't repeat it, going from Jiang Zemin to President Xi Jinping. So that has surprised me. But I say to people that I talk with on this, listen, if you think that we're going to be the ones that change China's political system, you're going to be bumping up against a hard wall there. And so I actually think we should have, our objectives should be focused on other things. They should be focused on the things I was talking about and making sure we have a level economic playing field and resolving all the other, or as many of the other issues as we can. And many of them won't be resolvable. So we'll be just figuring out, as I said, what this new strategic framework will be like between our two countries.
I see we have 0 minutes left here.
Shucks.
Last question. How important is it for the U.S. to have a dialogue with Europe and others who may have some of the same issues? And is there a way to, find a pathway forward? Because, as you said, the entire global economy is at stake. This isn't just a bilateral issue.
Of course. Of course. And I think I hit that pretty hard in my speech, that I think that will be much more effective if we can work with others where we have common interests. And I think a lot of getting the strategic relationship with China right is getting it right with others around the world and figuring out how to reshape and adapt and modernize some of these institutions. And I'd say if China didn't exist, it would still be a big job to adapt. Change is difficult, and to adapt these institutions. And the global economy has changed. When you look at where the growth is coming from, so much of it is going to be coming not from the West. And certainly there are plenty of other countries other than China that are going to have a lot to say about this. So, this is difficult stuff. It's a lot easier to give a speech than to figure out how to change some of these things. That's one of the reasons why I'm really sober about this and about the risks that we face. And I think the biggest source of optimism I have is because if we don't come up with some way to work together and reset the relationship, it's going to be a disaster. As I said, the international, world order is too big to fail. We can't let it fail. And so that's why we have to get together and solve it.
And have you given up on China, that they will realize that they have a huge stake in that also?
I haven't. I didn't say that. I said exactly what I said in my speech. It's going to take wise leadership and statesmanship on both sides. I'm not giving up on anyone. I'm just saying that the trajectory we're on is not a good one. And it's going to take a lot of work in both countries and a lot of time, I think, to get there. But every little bit of progress along the way will be helpful, because any progress will be a positive sign and will be a small step in changing the trajectory.
Well, I think in the last 100 hours you've had about 30 hours in a plane, and I think you've done remarkably well with that. Please join me in thanking Secretary Paulson.
Thank you. Thank you, Josette. Thank you. Thank you.